like to welcome you all here today to this event to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, which takes place tomorrow, 27th of January, which is the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp in 1945. Holocaust Memorial Day commemorates the victims of the Holocaust, and this year the Linen Hall is marking it with an event that celebrates the life and work of an extraordinary woman who survived the Holocaust and made a new life for herself in Belfast. And that is the dancer, choreographer, teacher and writer Helen Lewis. I'm very pleased to have here today Maddy Tongue, who has travelled from England to be with us today, so thank you very much for that. Maddy was Helen's friend for more than 50 years, and as a dancer herself, she performed in many of Helen's most significant works. And Maddy has written this wonderful book, and I'm just going to hold it up, Helen Lewis, Shadows Behind the Dance. And it's a wonderful book, beautifully produced, and by the Belfast-based The Irish Pages Press. And the book focuses on Helen's story in Belfast and on her life as a dancer and as a creative force in Belfast. And this book complements Helen's own memoir, A Time to Speak, which was published in 1997 and is still in print. And that is a mark of what an important contribution that book has made. And it tells the story of the first 30 years of Helen's life in Czechoslovakia, including her professional training as a dancer and choreographer, and is also a harrowing account of what happened to her and to her family as a result of Nazi persecution and during the Holocaust. Maddy's book, which is available here today to buy, contains a full folio of Michael Longley's Holocaust poems and drawings by Sarah Longley. And if you haven't seen this book, it really is, it's really something. Actually, it's just tremendous. I'm delighted that Michael is here with us today to read some of those poems and to talk to us about Helen Lewis. Michael was Helen's friend for several decades and actually helped her to edit A Time to Speak, her memoir. As many of you know, Michael is a wonderful poet who has published 11 collections of poetry, most recently The Candlelight Master, and his work has been internationally recognised. Not only has he received the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, he was also the recipient of the Beltrinelli International Prize for Poetry, one of the major European honours for poetry. Maddy is a trained physiotherapist. She has an MA in creative writing and has had a long career as a dancer. She trained in modern dance with Helen Lewis and appeared in many dance, drama and opera productions with Cambridge Modern Ballet and Belfast Modern Dance Group, including some of Helen's early innovative work phases. She writes about dance and is currently living and teaching in Cambridge, England. So two terrific people to talk to us about Helen Lewis here today. And they're really going to be having a back and forth between them, Helen and Maddy. And we're not going to be taking any questions at the end. So it will be the conversation here today. And just before I let them speak, I'm going to ask Chris Agee from the Irish Pages Press to come and just say a couple of words. Thank you.
Many thanks, Patsy. She's done all the work of introduction, so I'll keep this super brief. We're delighted to be working in a collaboration with the Linen Hall Library. We look forward to doing other books like this in the future. So many thanks for coming out in the middle of the day to this important event. It's important both in a global sense, obviously. There will be probably hundreds, if not thousands, of events about Holocaust Memorial Day all over the world. So that's taken as read, but it's also a very important Belfast, because Maddy, of course, grew up in Belfast. Michael is a lover and long resident of Belfast, and a great Belfast poet, as well as an Irish poet, as well as an international poet. And of course, Belfast ultimately was Helen Lewis's second adopted home. So Maddy will read something from the book and make a few comments. Michael will read his poems and make a few comments about Maddy's book, and then maybe half an hour, 20 minutes for questions. And the book will be on sale at the back. So many thanks for coming and enjoy.
Yes, we thought that we wouldn't have questions from that panel.
Sorry.
You can't have, after the Holocaust, there's only one question, isn't it?
Why?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start this event, and before I even thank Patsy, I'm just going to mention that tomorrow evening at the Crescent Arts Centre, there's another dance event in honour of Helen, when a group of dancers here in Belfast are launching the bursary in Helen's name. And so everybody is welcome to come to that, 5:30 tomorrow at the Crescent Arts Centre. And it'll be another feast of dance with films, I think, and talk. But yes, I must thank Patsy for that very generous introduction, and I thank Chris too. And I particularly thank the Linen Hall Library for having me. I've been coming to this library since I was a child, and it's always been a place of wonder and delight. And I'm also thrilled to be here with so many people in this room who knew Helen, who were friends with Helen. There's a sort of warmth in the room, which I really appreciate. So let me just start with a brief summary of Helen, which you probably all know. But she was born in 1916 in Trutnov in Czechoslovakia, born into a very cultured home. And she was always determined to be a dancer. She trained in Prague, and she completed her professional training, but instead of a promising career in dance, she got caught up in the Nazis' plans for the Jews of Europe as deportations began. On the 5th of August in 1942, Helen and her young husband assembled with many others in the Trade Fair Hall in Prague. 5 days later, they were marched at night in the dark through the streets of Prague to the station en route to Terezín camp. Helen was later moved on to Auschwitz, Birkenau, Stutthof, and eventually to the labor camp at Kokstedt on the Baltic coast. Helen, we know, wrote a very moving account of her Holocaust experiences in A Time to Speak, published in 1992. But she stopped that book, or she ended it, in 1945, at the end of the war. And then she came to live in Belfast for another 5 decades. And she's changed the artistic landscape in this country through dance. And I wanted to write an account of the extraordinary work she did here in those years. When I was writing my book, I got an email from one of her sons, a very long email. One of the phrases jumped out at me. She wanted to seem normal. She wanted to seem normal. I smiled somewhat at that because, you know, if you knew Helen, normal was not one word that you would use to describe her, but she wanted to seem normal. Well, of course I knew what he meant. Helen did not want to be known as a survivor. She did not want the Holocaust to pursue her as she forged a life in this country. And she did not want the baggage of her wartime experiences to hang around the necks of her children as they grew up. She arrived here in Belfast in 1947. Well, what sort of dance was there in Belfast in 1947? You could do ballet, you could do Irish dancing, perhaps you could do tap dancing, but was there any modern dance? No. Were there any dancers with experience of modern dance? No. And most importantly, was there an audience from modern dance? No. Helen, of course, arrived convinced that a career in dance was at an end for her. But one day, the headmaster of a local grammar school rang up to say that the school was going to put on a production of the opera The Battered Bride by Smetana, an opera for the school, The Battered Bride by Smetana. I can't even begin to imagine that. And he asked her, would she be interested in doing the dances? Helen eagerly agreed. After that, Mary O'Malley in the Lyric Theatre asked her, would she do some movement with the witches in a forthcoming production of Macbeth? And would she teach the junior drama section? So Helen began to teach. And so many of you here will have heard Helen say, I started teaching one day a week, and very soon I was teaching every day. Let me just read you an extract from my book. When I think of Helen, I recall a later moment when she brought me face to face with the reality of her previous life. Helen had been asked to talk and present some dance in Dublin. And with Helen and a few others, we took the Belfast to Dublin train. There was an excitement about this outing, a feeling of adventure. It was a train journey of around 2 hours and rather unusual in the early 1970s, as few people travelled across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Such journeys were far from normal, as the train between Belfast and Dublin was a regular target for terrorist attacks, bombs on the track being an expected hazard. So along with the excitement about the upcoming dance in a strange city was a feeling of apprehension as the train approached the border area. We'd been chatting amongst ourselves when unexpectedly Helen mentioned an episode from her former life during the war. Everything went blank for me as I was suddenly thrust into a different world. I knew nothing of Helen's background or the horrors she had experienced. She spoke briefly of the harshness of the conditions in Cockstead, a sub-camp of Stuttgart concentration camp near Gdansk on the Baltic coast, where in the winter of 1944, along with others, she was forced to build an airfield for the German war effort. That day on the Dublin train, her brief passing reference to the Labour camp was bewildering. I recall wondering, what was she talking about? What or where did this happen? I felt the horror, but had no framework, no understanding of what she might be referring to. I couldn't find a way into the subject. I felt helpless in the face of what she was trying to convey to us. And I didn't know what to ask, or indeed how to ask her a question. I fell silent and was overcome by a sense of shame at our collective ignorance. The moment passed, and she became once more our Helen, chatting and laughing, excited at the dance ahead, eager as always to begin another creative experience. Our bewilderment about her past gradually lessened, as on occasions she began to speak more openly about her wartime experiences. But only when she began to choreograph did it finally make sense. In the days and weeks following that Dublin visit. Those glimpses of the Holocaust completely faded from my mind. I didn't give them much thought. But what about Helen? She couldn't forget. She spoke often of the harrowing nightmares she suffered in the post-war period, which continued until her first son was born, and then they never came back. But the memories of her wartime experiences gradually became entwined with dance. Michael.
It's extraordinary to be here with Maddy, celebrating Maddy's book and remembering Helen's book on Holocaust Day. And I was, one of the blessings that have come my way is to have Helen as a neighbour. Just about 4 minutes walk from our house, there was Helen. And I got to know her because my two daughters, Becky and Sarah, went to her dancing classes. And I would talk to darling Helen when I was collecting the girls from those classes. And I got to know her, and I would walk past her house frequently, and I would pop in from time to time. And she had a kind of a sun trap in the front garden where she would sit and absorb the sun. And I joined her one day, and that's when I noticed the tattoo on her arm. And of course, I knew what it was, and I put two and two together, but I never broached the subject. And she didn't talk about it. And then, round about October 1986, when her first grandchild was born, she decided to put down her reminiscences of the nightmare, to have that information handed on to another generation. And I was flattered when she asked me to look over her work. And that meant that every now and again, big brown envelopes would flop to our letterbox. And I would, either in her house, mainly in her house, sometimes in my house, we would look over it. But really, I was only a French polisher, because Helen was a natural stylist and storyteller. And so the book emerged, and that's when I got to meet Harry. And I remember his head, smoky head, he always had a cigarette going around the door and see how it was going. And he'd say, "Who'd have thought I had married such a pearl?" And one of the things I'm proudest of, really, and I know that Anne Tannehill of Blackstaff Press is to say, was getting this book launched. And it became an Irish bestseller and saw several translations. Now, I ended my introduction to this wonderful book. This is the second edition. I'll just read these three short sentences. I said, Helen Lewis fought for breath in history's filthiest corner. She survived to teach people dancing, young people dancing in Belfast, and to give the world this devastating testament. She died in Belfast when it was snowing on New Year's Eve 2009. And I wrote a little epitaph for her, just 4 lines. Epitaphs have to be short, but I like short poems anyway. Helen, it is snowing, Helen. You want to go. Your ashes fall like snow. Now at last, those terrible numbers above your wrist add up to you. Your ashes fall like snow. And I was electrified by her horrific memories, and I wrote a sequence called Ghetto, which I'm going to read a good bit of. I'll read 4 or 5 sections of it. None of them are very long, but each one of them I showed to Helen, and I wouldn't have published them unless I'd got the good housekeeping seal of approval from Helen. Ghetto 1. Because you will suffer soon and die, your choices are neither right nor wrong. A spoon will feed you, a flannel keep you clean, a toothbrush bring you back to your bathroom's view of chimney pots and gardens. With so little time for inventory or leave taking, you are packing now for the rest of your life photographs, medicines, a change of underwear, a book, a candlestick, a loaf, sardines, needle and thread. These are your heirlooms, perishables, worldly goods. What you bring is the same as what you leave behind, your last belonging, a list of your belongings. This is number 3. The little girl without a mother behaves like a mother, with her rag doll to whom she explains fear and anguish, the meagerness of the bread ration, how to make it last, how to get back to the doll's house and lift up the roof, and before the flamethrowers and dynamiters destroy it, how to rescue from their separate rooms love and sorrow, masterpieces the size of a postage stamp, small fortunes. From among the hundreds of thousands, I can imagine one behind the barbed wire fences as my train crosses Poland. I see him for long enough to catch the sprinkle of snowflakes on his hair and school bag, and then I am transported away from that world of broken hobby horses and silent toys. He turns into a little snowman and refuses to melt. Fingers leave shadows on a violin, harmonics, a blackbird fluttering between electrified fences. The last one of the sequence. Lessons were forbidden in that terrible school. Punishable by death were reading and writing and arithmetic, so that even the junior infants grew old and wise in lofts studying these subjects. There were drawing lessons and drawings of kitchens and farms, farm animals, butterflies, mothers, fathers, who survived in crayon until in pen and ink they turned into guards at executions and funerals, torturing and hanging even these stick figures. There were drawings of barracks and latrines as well, and the only windows were the windows they drew. And Harry, Helen's first husband died in a death march in 1945. And she came by miracle to Belfast when she married an old flame, Harry. And Harry sold linen handkerchiefs. And in this little poem, with just 2 quatrains, I imagine Helen, how do I explain it? In this, Helen becomes Odysseus. So Odysseus is not a man, he's a young girl. and this is about Harry, the linen industry, and their love for each other. And I'll hand over to Maddy. It's been wonderful, really, my involvement not only with Helen, but with Maddy and with Chris and Anne Tannehill, and this huge circle of warmth which still surrounds the name of Helen. The linen handkerchief. Northern Bohemia's flax fields and the flax fields of Northern Ireland, the linen industry, brought Harry, trader in linen handkerchiefs, to Belfast, and then, after Terezin and widowhood and Auschwitz, you, Odysseus as a girl, your sail a linen handkerchief on which he embroidered and unpicked hundreds of names all through the war. But in one corner, the flowers encircling your initials never came undone.
Thank you. Yeah. In 1962, Helen created a performance group, and she created this with a sense of urgency. It allowed her to present work that showed her wartime experiences. She wasn't ready to use words to relate the horror, but the trauma embedded in her body and mind could be expressed in a physical way through the language of dance. And she turned to choreography to work out what she couldn't say at the time. She wanted original music, and she asked Alan, my husband, to write the music. She wrote out a synopsis of what she wanted to say in this piece. She wrote it on 2 scraps of paper torn out of a notebook, and I'm glad to say that those scraps of paper, the very important dance record, are now in the archive, the Helen Lewis archive, here in the Linen Hall Library. She wrote on that piece of paper, I wanted to do something dramatic and peace-loving, and the episode I call Persecution came out of my experience, not just personal, mine, but the experience in Europe, persecution of faith, of being different. And she called the piece Phases and presented it in an evening of dance festival 64 at Queen's University. And in Phases, the shadows from her former life began to appear in dance form. She didn't shy away from showing the harshness, the rawness, the cruelty of life in the camps. And looking back, I am amazed at what she presented. In Persecution, it was a harrowing episode. 2 menacing guards drag a terrified girl on stage, and together they dance a pas de trois, during which Helen describes they drag her round with violence and brutality. The everyman character watches hypnotized without moving. Finally, the girl manages to throw one end of the veil like a lifeline. He makes a grab for it, but doesn't get it. He wants to help her, but is too late. And they drag her off, and he is left with the veil. And her note to Alan says, theme music very mournful, reminiscent of their dance together. Phases was a fierce piece, and it was even an angry piece. And when I think of Helen's later works, they were much more mellow, full of compassion, and emphasized the relationships between people, between different groups, between the outsider, between people who found that the bureaucratic state didn't answer their needs, and they were looking for another person who might be similar. Never was another work quite so angry, quite so strong, actually, as that fit. It was a fierce piece, but it must have been something which Helen needed to do at the time. So the point is, she had one final episode after persecution, and I asked the creative people in this room, how would you follow that in dance? Well, Helen said that in the last episode, which she called Peace, the lights would come up on a group of wretches fighting over a piece of cloth, possibly the veil, reminiscent of those fighting beneath the cross. They attack each other furiously, and they appeal to the everyman character for help. And he brings peace to them. They dance together. They put the veil, the cloak, round him like a cloak, and they leave as friends. And Helen wrote, he has for once actively done good, whereas before he had behaved either passively or foolishly. And her note to Alan said at the end, the theme music needs to end on an optimistic note, but not too triumphant. But you know, also her work had moments of intense joy and playfulness. It wasn't all grim. And from childhood, it was the creative process in dance which appealed to her, to search and experiment constantly. And Helen, again, in her own words, said, it sometimes takes a lot of courage to believe in one's ability to find the image. Usually it is a slow and painful process, but occasionally one is blessed with an illumination which elevates it to the level of poetry. And remember, in those days, Helen presented recitals of dance regularly, nearly every year. And for that, she had to hire a hall for the performance in central Belfast. She had to hire a hall for rehearsals. She had to hire musicians. She got her programs printed, tickets printed, publicity. With all that, with little or no state support, she was determined and dogged about bringing modern dance to the city. Of course, once Helen's book was published in 1992, she was interviewed and asked many times to speak about her Holocaust experiences. And in 1993, when the Anne Frank exhibition came to Northern Ireland, she was asked to create a dance piece for that occasion. 4 young dancers came from the Ulster Youth Dance. Then came an invitation from the Dance Theatre of Duisburg in Germany, who had decided to include the dance of Anne Frank in their program to commemorate the end of World War II. So how did Helen view that invitation from Germany? She thought about it and she said, I felt slightly uneasy when faced with the responsibility of choreographing and rehearsing the Anne Frank story with German dancers. And I know that they too did not know what to expect from me on a personal level. But through dance workshops, we found a way to Anne Frank and each other. And as our doubts vanished, we realized how privileged we were to recreate together the spirit of Anne Frank through the language of dance. Michael.
Very good. The last time I spoke about Helen in public, I said that I thought of her as a bird of paradise among us house sparrows. And I remember that Helen liked you to give notice that we're going to call, and that gave her time to put on her earrings and her makeup. And there was great elegance and style in her, and everything she did was worth looking at. Just watching, just the way she only smoked about 2 or 3 cigarettes a day, but when she opened the gold box and took it out, and it really, she made it look as though cigarettes were terribly good for you. And pouring a cup of tea, yes, that was quite a ceremony, although the tea she brewed was always pretty awful. She was a mid-European coffee drinker, and she spoke with a similar economy and precision. Her sentences in her conversation, as well as in her prose, were waste-free, and her head was full of opinion and insight, and it was very difficult to realize that English was her third language. And I remember her saying to me, how many languages do you speak, my dear? There was great warmth and charm in her personality, but nothing cozy. There was a squeeze of lemon in most of what she said. Now, I want to close my contribution to this important occasion by telling you about an extraordinary coincidence. And this concerns this Stolperstein, or in English, the stumble stones. Now, when Edna and I were in Rome in 2022, we saw among the cobbles these, about that size, little brass plaques. And this was the brainwave of an artist called Gunter Demnig. And he has, over the years, it's 70,000 of these plaques in all the cities of Europe. And each plaque commemorates somebody who died in the Holocaust. And the plaque is placed outside their home. And you see that the Germans came in and rounded them up, gave them so many hours to pack their bags, and then they were carted off to their deaths mainly. And each plaque begins, "Here lived," and then they're followed the victim's name, the date of birth, and their fate. Their fate would be internment or suicide, exile, or in the vast majority of cases, deportation and murder. These are placed close to their house where they were taken away from. And it's the largest decentralized monument in the world, and it's so vivid and personal, and without any of the grandiosity of so many memorials. And I started to write about the stumble stones. And then I heard, and this is the most extraordinary and thrilling coincidence, I heard from Robin that he and his brother Michael, Helen's sons, were going to go to Prague for the unveiling, if that's what you would call it, of 3 stumble stones. One for Helen, one for her husband, and one for her mother. And they were on the pavement outside where they had lived. And they both went there. And Demnig adapts something in the Talmud, a wonderful statement. A person is only forgotten when his or her name is forgotten. And Helen began her life as Helena Katz, and then she married and she became Helena Hermanova or Hermanova, I don't know the name. And I'll read this poem. It's called Evictions. It's in 3 short parts. Brass square evictions are called it. 1. Brass squares among the cobblestones record who were evicted from their homes and shops and where they were taken away to die. I bow before the dead to read their names, and I stumble over these stumble stones. It will take me a lifetime to walk home. 2. At dawn, a German couple is waiting in the shadowy hallway while you pack a few belongings for the rest of your lives. Your bed still warm for them where you made love. 3. Outside the block of flats in Plaweczka in Prague, a new stumblestone remembers Helena Hermanova Nakats, born 1916, deported 1942 to Terezin, 1944 to Auschwitz, liberated. There's a second stone for her husband Pavel, murdered 1945 on a death march, and a third stone for her mother Elsa, deported to Lublin 1942, murdered. Helena Hermanova married Harry, an old flame, and lived the rest of her life just round the corner in South Belfast as Helen Lewis, choreographer, teacher of dancing who had danced in hell.
But let me just bring you back to Helen, the friend, the mentor, the support, even a career counselor to many of us. And her home in South Belfast became a mecca for so many of us, so many of her friends and neighbours. And we would gather there, maybe late at night, after a performance, and gossip and discuss what had been going on. And Helen would serve black coffee in the early 60s, at a time when hardly anybody drank any proper coffee of any sort. She served black coffee and the most chocolate biscuits we'd ever eaten. And she would light a cigarette. And then maybe she'd light another cigarette. And it seemed the height of sophistication to us in those far-off days. And we felt, as the smoke circled round the room, we felt ourselves drift away from the smallness of Northern Ireland and think that perhaps we were in some capital city in Central Europe where everyone drank black coffee and ate chocolate biscuits and smoked at midnight. Thank you, Helen, for those wonderful memories you gave us. But let me end by reminding everyone that Helen, in the last days of the war, danced in that Coxted labour camp, exhausted and starving to a degree none of us here can imagine. She danced on frost-bitten feet for an audience of one, the SS woman who had the power to destroy her. She danced a tango, not daring to look at her. And when it ended, there was no clapping, no reaction, there was silence. The woman sat there for a long time, then got up and walked out without a word. The next morning, standing at roll call in unbearable cold, orders were given over the loudspeaker that the dancers should be excused from working outside It meant warmth and an extra slice of bread each day. Helen wrote, "I owe my presence here to my role as witness and survivor of the death camps, but also to my mental and physical recovery through dance. Dance," and here I quote Jane Coyle, who wrote so movingly in the Irish Times last January in 2023 when we published my book. "Dance it was that offered her creative redemption and spiritual nourishment during those dark days. Dance had rescued her from deportation on the lorry that arrived every week to load up its human cargo for extermination. And never for a single moment did she doubt that dance saved her life. She wanted to seem normal." Thank you.
Feel very privileged to have been in the room for this event. It just was a tremendous thank you so much to Maddy and Michael for sharing their memories and stories of Helen and the terrific poetry. And we definitely have remembered Helen's name today, and that is so important. And just thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for coming today. I said the books are available for sale at the back of the room, and yeah, I say thank you so much. Thank you to Michael and to Maddy.